Hey guys, tonight we're going way back, like fire hasn't been tamed yet back. You're crouched beside a smoky campfire, your face flickering orange in the glow, your hands freezing despite the dancing flames. All around you is pitch black. No streetlights, no lamps, no plug-in nightlights shaped like ducks. Just darkness. And guess what? You're not going to make it through the night unless that fire holds. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, what's your location and local time right now? Pop it in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel it first in your fingertips, a chill spreading slowly, quietly. The sky is already deep purple, and the sun's retreat is non-negotiable. But you're not afraid, at least not totally, because in front of you, nestled in a carved stone dish, is a tiny flame. Primitive, wobbly, alive. Maybe it's a scoop of animal fat with a moss wick, or maybe it's a hollowed-out seashell filled with oil and a bit of string. Either way, this is your savior. This is the world's first candle. Well, technically, historians debate what qualifies as the first candle. Some argue it was the rushlight, a dried reed dipped in melted fat. Others say the honor goes to oil lamps, those little clay saucers you've probably seen in museums. But regardless of classification, the motive was simple. People needed light, and the sun was rude enough to keep disappearing. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The earliest known examples of artificial lighting devices come from around 5000 BCE. Archaeologists have found shell lamps in places like Egypt and Mesopotamia. These shells weren't beachy decor, they were functional, filled with oil and set with plant fibers that smoldered just enough to keep things visible. Now picture a prehistoric cave or a Neolithic hut. It's not like people back then were set in the mood with scented tea lights. This was about survival. You needed to see your tools, your baby, your entrance, and maybe that bear sneaking around outside. A little flame changed everything. It extended the day. It let you tell stories, cook longer, pray to the stars, or stare at your crush across the dirt floor. Because yes, even before Instagram, humans found ways to make lighting romantic. And oh, the stench. Those early makeshift lights reeked. Fat from fish, cows, pigs, whatever was available, would be rendered down into a thick goo that smoked up every enclosed space. Your cozy little hut? More like a chimney with a dirt floor. But you dealt with it, because a flame meant hope, even if it meant coughing through your nightly routine. Funny aside, historians believe that in some early societies they used animal dung as part of their lighting system. Dried dung mixed into the fat helped it burn longer. So the next time your candle burns too fast, just be grateful it doesn't smell like a barn fire. As with everything in ancient life, the invention of better lighting was slow. Like glacier melting slow. You didn't just wake up one day and say, "I'll invent a candle." You had to hunt, gather, butcher, render, mold, and test. Then fail a lot. Imagine standing in the wind with your fifth failed wick, muttering something prehistoric and angry, but that was the magic. Trial and error. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it worked. Now here's a strange fringe detail. In some early nomadic societies, candle-like devices were used not just for light, but as primitive timekeepers. That's right, candle clocks. You'd mark a stick of tallow with notches, and as the candle burned down to each mark, you'd know roughly how much time had passed. Of course, this only worked if the candle didn't drip unevenly, get blown out, or get eaten by a curious goat. But it was a start. Over time, these primitive light sources began to evolve, not because people were suddenly smarter, but because necessity forced creativity. Cold nights, spiritual rituals, scary shadows, and a basic need to not walk face first into your own door led people to experiment with all kinds of lighting methods. In different regions, folks use different materials: yak butter in Tibet, coconut oil in parts of India, seal blubber among Arctic communities. Each culture molded its own version of the candle based on what the environment gave them, and each one had its own quirks. Some scholars think the origin of the candle should actually be credited more to cultural rituals than to practical need. After all, light meant more than survival. It meant mystery. Fire flickered, shadows danced, and suddenly the darkness wasn't just darkness. It was sacred. It was storytelling. It was the place where gods whispered and ancestors appeared in flame-lit corners. This spiritual angle stuck around. For millennia, we'll see it over and over in the history of candle making. Candles weren't just objects, they were symbols. You didn't just light a candle, you invited something: protection, memory, divinity, or maybe just enough glow to find your sandals. And the symbolism didn't stop ancient inventors from getting creative. Wicks, for instance, were a hot mess for ages. Early wicks were usually twisted bits of papyrus, reed, or even animal hair. They burned too fast, or too unevenly, or not at all. And yet, people kept lighting them, because even a terrible candle was better than nothing. Imagine your whole life structured around the sun. Wake with the sunrise, eat before the sunset, work while there's light, sleep when there isn't. And then, suddenly, you've got a device that lets you cheat time, just a bit. That tiny flame gave you the power to read a few extra lines of text, or carve a tool, or spy on your neighbors arguing, or sew something wonky by firelight, or maybe light the world's worst-smelling bathroom. Of course, candles also introduced a few problems. Fire safety? Not a thing. People burned their homes down with alarming regularity. You'd think a flaming stick of fat would come with a warning label, but alas, early humans didn't have TikTok tutorials about proper placement. Now here's a final tidbit to tuck in with. In some ancient households, candles weren't used just indoors. They were placed outside to ward off evil spirits. They believed light could trick malevolent forces into thinking someone was home and watching. A spiritual scarecrow, but make it fire. So there you are, sitting in the dirt. Your only source of light is flickering. It's smoky. It smells like cooked squirrel and regret. But you have fire, and you're not totally blind anymore. You've got a fighting chance against the dark, and a new tool that's going to take thousands of years to really get good at. But it all starts here, with you, a flame, and the stubborn brilliance of early humanity refusing to go quietly into the night. The wind hisses through the reeds. It's not a full howl, just enough to remind you that nature has zero interest in your comfort. But nestled in your calloused palm is one of civilization's most underrated inventions, a rushlight. It's exactly what it sounds like, a rush, like an actual plant, the kind that grows along the banks of rivers and marshes. You take one of these long, spongy stalks, peel it down to its soft white core, dry it, and then soak it in rendered animal fat until it's completely saturated and slightly disgusting. Then you light it, and voila, you've got yourself a medieval nightlight that will burn for about 15 minutes and smell like bacon made by a ghost. Rushlights weren't technically candles, but they were close enough for poor folks who didn't have access to beeswax or fancy molds. They burned quick and dirty, no frills, no holders. You'd shove the rush into a split stick or a clamp on the wall, light it, and pray your hay roof didn't catch fire. Historians agree these were in common use throughout ancient Britain and parts of northern Europe, especially from around 1000 BCE onward. They were popular in rural homes where resources were limited and people needed a way, any way, to see after sunset. You can imagine how this would go down. Picture yourself in a tiny wooden cottage. The walls are weeping cold. The floor is straw. A goat might be sleeping under your bed. You're hunched over a bowl of cabbage stew, and the only thing separating you from complete darkness is a sputtering reed dipped in sheep goo. Romantic, right? But here's a strange little side note. Not all rushlights were made equal. Some regions added herbs to the fat mixture, rosemary, thyme, even crushed lavender, not for the ambiance, but to help mask the gut-wrenching stench. So yes, you're technically inventing aromatherapy, one burnt herb at a time, and for the upper crust. Rushlights were peasant tech. Wealthier households might dabble in more sophisticated oil lamps or even beeswax candles, which we'll talk about later. But the poor? They clung to rushlights like a toddler with a security blanket. And they had to, because every scrap of light extended their ability to work, eat, think, and occasionally knit mittens that looked nothing like mittens. Now, here's something that'll make you appreciate your LED bulbs. Rushlights were infamously finicky. If the wind so much as sneezed, they'd go out. If the fat wasn't thick enough, they'd sputter and die. If you tried to move one while it was burning, congratulations, you just flung fire at your curtain. Scholars still debate how long the average rushlight burned. Some say 20 minutes, others argue closer to 10. What they agree on is this: you needed a lot of them, which meant constant dipping, drying, and prepping. It was a whole household chore. Forget Netflix. Your evening entertainment was restocking rushlights and hoping your youngest kid didn't eat one. Let's throw in a quirky fringe. Fact: rushlight clamps became a weird flex for craftsmen. Some of the holders discovered in old cottages are beautifully wrought. Ironwork twisted into spirals and curls like something out of a fantasy novel, all for a flame that barely lasted a meal. Style over substance? Maybe, but even medieval folks liked their gear to look cool. And then there's the fire risk. Oh, the fire risk. Imagine your house is built entirely of timber, straw, and dreams. Now add open flame everywhere. Rushlights weren't just smoky, they were unstable. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence suggesting that entire villages burned down thanks to one poorly wedged rush. And yet, people kept using them. Why? Because the alternative was darkness, and nobody back then was walking around with night vision goggles and battery-powered lanterns. It's easy now to forget how dependent life was on the sun. A day without rushlights or candles wasn't just inconvenient, it was paralyzing. You couldn't cook safely, you couldn't sew or mend. You couldn't watch for wolves sneaking into your livestock pen. Darkness was powerlessness. Some historians argue that the rise of rushlight usage is one of the unspoken reasons Europe's population could grow. Light meant longer productivity. Longer productivity meant more food, more repairs, more stuff getting done. And if you're a peasant in 700 CE, getting anything done is a win. You're not just burning a stick here, you're lighting a path toward the future. Still, rushlights were never considered glamorous. They were the Crocs of lighting. Functional, unfashionable, and somehow always covered in something weird. Eventually they'd be replaced by better candles, cleaner fuel, and smarter wicks. But for a long time, they were the unsung heroes of after-dark survival. And let's be honest, there's something kind of sweet about them. A humble reed, soaked in the scraps of your last meal, lit with a flint you've struck 100 times before, glowing just enough to show your baby's sleeping face, or the half-mended shirt in your lap, or the steam rising from your stew. It's not much, but it's something. Here's your mainstream historical tidbit of the night. Rushlights were still being used in rural parts of Britain well into the 19th century. That's right. Some people were lighting up sheep fat reeds during the same era. Trains were roaring across industrial cities, two worlds, one timeline, held together by tiny flames. And finally, a fun, or mildly horrifying, curiosity. In some regions, rushlights were used to light the way for funeral processions. Imagine a long line of mourners walking slowly down a muddy road, each one holding a flickering, foul-smelling reed. There's something poetic about it, light leading the dead to rest, unless the wind blows them out. Then you've got a bunch of sad people bumping into trees. So as you sit in your imagined thatched roof cottage, your rushlight burning lower and lower, take a moment to appreciate the absurd fragility of it all. One flame, one tiny miracle keeping the darkness back. It's not perfect, it's not clean, but it's yours. And in the great dim-lit march of human progress, that little reed dipped in fat, it matters more than most people remember. The floor is smooth marble. The ceiling soars above you, painted with faded frescoes and edged in shadows that flicker like restless ghosts. You're not in a medieval hut anymore. Nope, you've time traveled. Again, this time you're in Rome. And not modern Rome with its scooters and espresso shots. Ancient Rome, where sandals slap against cobblestones and everyone smells faintly of olive oil, ambition, and political unrest. And in your hand, something far superior to a stinky reed dipped in sheep goo, beeswax. Yes, my soot-covered friend, you've leveled up. This is candle luxury, smooth, clean-burning, sweet-smelling. Beeswax was the gold standard of illumination in the Roman Empire. It burned longer, dripped less, and, most importantly, didn't make your house smell like a barbecue gone wrong. Only problem? It was expensive, like sold by the ounce and guarded like treasure expensive. If you were lighting beeswax candles, you weren't just trying to see, you were trying to impress. Beeswax was often reserved for temples, noble houses, and the ever-image-conscious elite. Because in Rome, your lighting choices were a status symbol. You might as well have walked around with a scented candle from the imperial bathhouse shouting, "Look at me, I can afford to not smell like cow grease." Here's a mainstream historical nugget. Roman records show that beeswax was imported and taxed heavily, especially when shipped from faraway provinces. This gave rise to some, shall we say, creative tax dodging. People smuggled wax. Yes, smuggled it. Wax was worth that much. Just picture a merchant in a toga trying to hide yellow blocks of beeswax under a pile of figs, all for that sweet, smokeless glow. But lighting in Rome wasn't all fragrant opulence and fancy chandeliers. Most Romans still relied on the humble oil lamp. Clay, round and carved with little reliefs of gods, animals, or some guy who looked like he hadn't slept in years. These lamps were filled with olive oil and lit with flax or linen wicks. Functional, cheap, and absolutely everywhere. Still, candles made of beeswax were catching on, especially for religious use. Temples used them as offerings, symbols of purity and divine favor. Light had moved beyond mere utility. Now it had spiritual gravitas. A flame could honor a god, mark a festival, or illuminate a scroll containing sacred law. But let's not skip over a particularly strange fringe tidbit. In some Roman cults, candles were used in secret nighttime rituals. Think underground worship, veiled statues, and shadowy initiations. The details? Murky at best. Scholars argue whether these were actual practices or just over-dramatic Roman gossip. But either way, candles had power, literal and symbolic. And speaking of gossip, let's talk about the wick problem. Early wicks were still a disaster. Most were just twisted plant fibers, papyrus, linen, or anything stringy that didn't immediately extinguish when dipped in wax. Roman candle makers experimented with braiding techniques to help the wick burn evenly without needing constant trimming. Did they succeed? Partially. If you didn't trim your wick, the flame would mushroom out like a torch and drop molten wax on your nice mosaic floor. Not ideal. That's why candle snuffers existed. Long-handled tools that looked a bit like tiny metal hats. You'd lower the snuffer over the flame to extinguish it without blowing wax everywhere. Because nothing ruins a philosophical debate like a surprise fireball. Here's where things get a little less charming. Most Romans didn't actually make their own candles. They bought them from chandlers. That's what candle makers were called. These folks were like the baristas of the ancient world, except instead of lattes, they sold wax, wicks, and maybe mild judgment about your soot-covered toga. And now for a fun, slightly disturbing detail. Not all Roman candles were made from beeswax. Some were made from tallow, animal fat. Yes, even in Rome. The poor, as always, had their own version of everything, and when wax was too pricey, they reverted to the old methods. Tallow candles smoked more, smelled worse, and melted into puddles of greasy despair. But hey, they worked. Imagine it, a lavish banquet in the atrium, musicians playing lyres, platters of roast boar, and on the fringes of the room, slaves scurrying around, lighting beeswax candles in bronze sconces while the air smells faintly of honey. Now cut to the back alleys, where a potter's apprentice squints over his broken bowl by the light of a sagging tallow stick dripping onto the floor. Same empire, different worlds, united only by the desperate need to see after sunset. Some scholars still argue about how common candles really were in Roman homes. Were they rare luxuries or just more widespread than we think thanks to the massive beeswax trade across the Mediterranean? The evidence is patchy. What we know for sure is that wherever candles appeared, they brought with them a strange new possibility: control over time. Now you could stay awake longer, work longer, worship longer, and maybe, just maybe, plot against your political enemies in dramatically lit silence. Let's take a moment to appreciate the absurdity of it all. You in a tunic holding a lump of wax that a bee colony worked thousands of hours to create. You mold it into a cylinder, shove a flax wick through the middle, and light it with a bit of smoldering wood. And now, behold, your tiny corner of the villa is no longer swallowed by night. If that's not magical, I don't know what is. By the late Roman Empire, candles had found their place in every layer of society: temples, homes, street stalls, catacombs. Their flickering presence was part of daily life and death, especially death. Candles were a mainstay in Roman funerary rites, placed near the body, burned during wakes, and sometimes sealed inside tombs, as if the dead might still need to see in the afterlife. Thoughtful, creepy, slightly flammable. And speaking of tombs, archaeologists have unearthed bits of wax residue in burial chambers that date back to this era, little ghostly fingerprints of a life once lived by candlelight, or at least mourned by it. So here we are. You're reclined on a Roman couch, a beeswax candle flickering near your scroll of poetry. The room smells faintly of honey, olive oil, and ambition. Shadows bounce gently along the walls, dancing to a rhythm older than empire. It's not perfect light, but it's refined. You've made it past reeds and rushlights. You've earned this glow. Tomorrow the empire might fall. Armies might march. Forums might erupt in scandal. But tonight, you have fire. Sweet-smelling, clean-burning fire. You wake up to the distant sound of church bells echoing across damp stone walls. You're no longer lounging in a Roman villa. You're somewhere colder, wilder, somewhere where candles don't just illuminate, they sanctify. Welcome to medieval Europe. Outside your window, if you had one, a thick mist clings to mossy rooftops and crooked wooden fences. Inside, the air smells like wool, ash, and something vaguely divine. You're in a monastery, and guess what? You're surrounded by candle nerds. That's right. Monks were the original candle influencers. Monasteries during the medieval period weren't just spiritual hubs. They were industrial centers for candle production, specifically beeswax candles, which had become the holy grail of church lighting. Why beeswax? Because it burned clean, pure, and didn't reek of barnyard sorrow like tallow did. Also, symbolically, beeswax was seen as virginal, produced without animal death, so it lined up nicely with monastic values, especially when you're chanting 7 times a day in Latin. Mainstream historical fact time. By the 9th century, many monasteries across Europe had beekeeping operations specifically to support their candle needs. Yep, rows and rows of buzzing little monks' insects producing the golden goop of illumination. Imagine Brother Thomas trying not to scream as he harvests honeycombs in full wool robes. A truly pious ordeal. Monks would melt the wax down slowly, pour it into metal or wooden molds, or dip wicks into vats over and over until the right thickness was achieved. Patience was a virtue, and it was literally baked into the wax. These weren't factory candles. Each one was handmade with the same meditative care as a manuscript. But don't get too dreamy. The early medieval wick game was still rough. They often used twisted flax, hemp, or old bits of cloth. Some worked, some fizzled out halfway through Mass. There's even evidence monks used rush pith, yes, that soggy reed from earlier, as internal stiffeners inside their beeswax candles to improve burn consistency. So the rushlight never truly died, it just got a holy upgrade. Now for a strange fringe detail. Some abbeys produced candles so massive they functioned as timers for liturgical readings. They'd burn a certain number of inches per hour, and monks could pace their chanting by the flame. Too fast and you'd finish early, too slow and, well, not exactly a standing ovation in the cloister, nothing like performance anxiety with Gregorian backup vocals. Candles were essential to the spiritual theater of medieval life. The glow mattered, the smell mattered, the silence as flames flickered beside a stone altar. It all meant something. You weren't just lighting a room, you were inviting heaven. That's why churches hoarded beeswax like dragons hoarded gold. Candles burned constantly in chapels, sanctuaries, and reliquaries. Special feasts called for candlelit processions, and saints' days required even more. It was a full-blown wax economy. And here comes a little slap of irony. While the church reserved clean-burning beeswax for sacred spaces, everyone else was stuck with tallow. Ah, yes, good old tallow, the candle of the common man, or more accurately, the cow man. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat, usually from cattle or sheep. They were smelly, smoky, and attracted insects, but boy, were they cheap. If you were a peasant in 11th century England, tallow was your only shot at seeing after sundown, unless you fancied stumbling around in the dark with your pig. Tallow chandlers, those who made and sold candles, worked under fairly disgusting conditions. Imagine vats of boiling fat, flies everywhere, and the constant worry that the whole place might burst into flames. Candle making wasn't just unglamorous, it was dangerous, and yet essential. Entire cities relied on chandlers to supply their households with affordable candles. Here's a scholarly debate worth whispering about. Some historians argue that tallow candle production in cities contributed heavily to air pollution long before the industrial age. Others disagree, saying the scale wasn't large enough to matter. What is certain is that every urban neighborhood probably had a smell, a rich blend of cooked animal fat, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and maybe the lingering hope of better days. But monasteries, they smelled divine, literally. There's even a cheeky little anecdote buried in 12th century monastic writings that claims a novice monk once tried to eat a beeswax candle during a fast, thinking it was a gift from God. Honestly, if your daily diet was brown bread and spiritual yearning, a honey-scented wax stick probably did look appealing. The culinary reviews were mixed, but the point remains. Candles were omnipresent. You saw them, smelled them, sometimes mistook them for snacks. Back to the spiritual glow. Monks didn't just make candles for their own use. They supplied nearby churches, cathedrals, and even the occasional castle. Candle making became an act of devotion. And selling candles? That was part of the monastery's income stream. Who knew worship came with a revenue model? Let's zoom in on a moment. You're kneeling in a stone chapel. Your breath fogs slightly in the cold air. All around you, beeswax candles stand in iron holders, melting slowly, pooling golden drops into small plates. Each one is hand-rolled, probably by Brother Benedict, who hasn't smiled in 10 years. But you don't mind. The flames dance. The saints gaze down. And somewhere in that flicker, you feel connected, not just to God, but to humanity. To everyone who ever lit a candle to hold back the dark. Now let's go even darker. Some candles had interesting additives. In plague times, candles were sometimes infused with herbs and resins. juniper, frankincense, even powdered sapphire for the wealthy, in hopes they would purify the air. Because obviously, if a candle smells expensive enough, it can fight off the Black Death. That's science, right? Okay, no, not really, but people were desperate, and candles were all they had, a symbolic shield against the creeping unknown. Let's not forget their role in the domestic world. Medieval women also made candles, especially in rural areas. If you couldn't afford to buy from a chandler, you made your own. Boil the fat, dip the wick, hang it to cool, repeat over and over for hours. It was tedious, messy, and absolutely essential. Every home had its stash. Maybe not pretty, maybe not even consistent, but functional. Candles lit birth beds and death beds, meals and prayers, love letters and secret sins. They stood witness to everything, from royal coronations to peasant soup dinners, always present, always flickering, always there. By the end of the medieval period, candle making had become a recognized craft with its own guilds, rules, standards, apprenticeships. You couldn't just melt wax and call yourself a chandler anymore. You had to train. You had to know things, like which fat rendered best, which wick curled properly, how to pour without scalding your own face. You were part of a lineage now, illuminators of the night. So next time you light a vanilla-scented soy candle in your climate-controlled apartment, give a little nod to the monks, the chandlers, the peasants boiling fat in wooden sheds, all of them trying, in their own sticky, smoky ways, to push back the darkness. Because when you're in a world ruled by shadow, even the smallest flame can feel like salvation. You're back in the village now. Not the quiet peace of a candlelit chapel, not the soft reverence of monastic corridors. This time you're in the thick of things. Muddy roads, creaky carts, cows with opinions. Welcome to the medieval market square where the tallow trade is booming, and you, my friend, are about to smell terrible for the next few paragraphs. Tallow was, without exaggeration, the engine that lit the homes of medieval Europe. It was cheap, abundant, and wonderfully disgusting. Made by rendering down beef or mutton fat, tallow was the working class's answer to beeswax. Beeswax was reserved for the saints. Tallow? That was for everyone else. Your average cooper, blacksmith, washerwoman, and overly curious goat. Here's a historical fact to chew on, preferably not literally. During the 13th century, large European cities like Paris and London had entire guilds of chandlers who specialized exclusively in tallow candles. These folks worked in stalls or tiny workshops, boiling vats of suet, dipping wicks, and trying not to set their eyebrows on fire. Because yes, the process was dangerous. Hot fat plus open flames in wood frame buildings. Insurance companies today would weep. Let's talk process for a moment. Making a tallow candle wasn't an elegant affair. First you needed suet, the hard fat found around the kidneys of cows or sheep. This was chopped, melted slowly, very slowly, and then strained to remove the worst bits, and trust me, there were many bits. What remained was a thick, pale, wax-like substance that hardened as it cooled. The wick, typically made from twisted cotton or flax fibers, was repeatedly dipped into the hot tallow until the candle reached the desired thickness. Between dips, the wick was hung to cool, which is why old candle makers always looked like they were prepping for some kind of fat-drenched puppet show. Now here's where it gets fragrant. Tallow smells awful, think old meat, mixed with burning hair, and maybe a hint of defeat. Lighting a tallow candle was like summoning the ghost of a wet barnyard, which is why wealthier households, if they had to use tallow, burned it in kitchens or basements far from delicate noses. Still, people tolerated it. Why? Because darkness was worse. Tallow candles were accessible. They didn't require access to rare beeswax or a monastery's blessing. You could, if necessary, make one yourself with leftover fat from dinner, which led to an informal tradition of household chandling, people crafting a few personal candles at home when supplies were low or merchants were charging too much. Fun fringe fact. In some towns, chandlers had to follow strict zoning laws because of the stench. The candle makers weren't allowed to operate near churches, bakeries, or marketplaces where open flames and bad smells might ruin the ambiance or, cause a small civic inferno. Tallow candles weren't just about lighting, though. They had economic weight. Cities had laws regulating candle prices, weights, and quality. A dishonest chandler might shave weight from candles or mix in cheaper fats, like pig fat, extra smoky, extra grim. If caught, punishments range from fines to public shaming. Because nothing says corporate accountability like being forced to stand in the square wearing a sign that says I sold fake candles. And here's something scholars still scratch their heads over. Records from medieval England show a bizarre surge in candle thefts during the winter months. People broke into homes or shops to steal candles, not gold, not bread, candles. Because without light, you couldn't cook, work, read, or pray after sunset. A handful of large candles could mean survival. So let's imagine it. You're a peasant in the 14th century. You got a tiny cottage, a smoky hearth, a few potatoes, and maybe a chicken that hates you, and a stub of tallow candle, half used, bent from poor storage. When night falls, you light it. It flickers. It stinks. It fills the room with a greasy warmth, but for a moment you see your child's face clearly. You patch your cloak. You finish carving that spoon. You reclaim time from the dark. Now contrast that with the wealthier merchant's home across town. They have candles by the dozen, some even shaped or molded in decorative ways. Their tallow might be cleaner, triple rendered for clarity, still gross but less gag-inducing. They can afford to burn multiple candles in one room, a wild flex, and it shows just how much wealth determined not only what you owned, but what you could see. Back to our hard-working chandlers. These folks weren't romantic artisans. They were industrialists before industry. Some worked alone, others hired apprentices. Candle making was hard labor. You lugged heavy vats, stirred hot fat, twisted hundreds of wicks, and packed finished candles into bundles wrapped in cloth or straw for sale. Your hands were burned, your apron stank, and your hair smelled like disappointment. But your shop glowed at night, and in a world where darkness ruled most of the day, that mattered. One thing many people don't realize: the tallow trade wasn't local. Suet was imported and exported across borders. Wars disrupted candle markets. Cattle shortages meant lighting shortages. Some cities even stockpiled tallow like it was gold. Because when war or famine came, you could eat the candles. Yes, you read that right. Desperate peasants sometimes ate tallow candles during famines. It was technically edible, though about as appetizing as licking a grease trap. Still, it had calories. And if your belly was growling, a candle could be the difference between life and starvation. It's both horrifying and weirdly poetic. The light that kept you awake might also be the thing that kept you alive. There's an open scholarly debate about just how widespread this practice was. Some argue it's exaggerated, maybe limited to a few regions during intense crises. Others believe it was more common, just not widely recorded due to shame or fear of judgment. Either way, it gives a new meaning to the phrase, burning the candle at both ends. As the Middle Ages wound down and the Renaissance began to peek over the horizon, changes were coming. Wax quality improved, mold techniques advanced, scented oils were being added to high-end candles. But in most homes, the tallow candle still reigned supreme. Ugly, smelly, stubborn, but absolutely essential. So tonight, when you light your lavender candle in its glass jar, remember your medieval ancestors. They didn't have mood lighting or soft jazz. They had suet, smoke, and grit. They lit up the dark with whatever they had, and somehow they found warmth, visibility, and the faintest flicker of beauty in it. Because in the grand history of human light, even the foulest candle carried something sacred, the refusal to be swallowed by the dark. You're standing in a dim, crooked workshop now, The wooden beams above you groan like tired bones, and the floor is slick with wax drippings and soot stains. The air smells like everything: smoke, grease, iron, maybe even regret. This isn't a grand cathedral or a humble cottage. This is the heart of progress, or at least the medieval version of it. Because tonight we're solving a problem that's been plaguing candle makers for centuries: the dreaded, annoying, smoke-belching, wax-wasting wick. If the candle is the body, the wick is the nervous system. And early on, that nervous system had some serious issues. You see, primitive wicks didn't self-consume. They didn't curl and pull the flame inward. So unless you constantly trimmed them, they would balloon into fiery mushrooms that dripped wax everywhere, hissed like angry cats, and threw off a disgusting amount of smoke. Your average tallow candle from the 1200s was a full-time job. Light it, light it again, trim it again. You couldn't just set it and forget it, like your scented 3-wick at home. No, you had to babysit the flame like a cranky toddler with a lighter. Let's start with the basics. Early wicks were often made of plant fibers: twisted papyrus, linen, cotton, or even hemp. But twist quality varied wildly. A bad wick either wouldn't stay lit or would burn too quickly. If you've ever watched a candle sputter out mid-use, imagine that happening every single time. With firewood scarce and candles expensive, a dud wick wasn't just annoying, it was a setback. Now here's a fun historical fact. Wick trimmers were a real thing. Like an actual tool with ornate handles and a little box attached to catch the burnt end. In wealthier homes and churches, a servant or acolyte was often assigned the noble role of wick snuffer. That was your job, all night. Trim the wicks, snuff the flame, trim again. By candlelight, of course. In monasteries where long candlelit vigils were common, wicks were trimmed with the kind of frequency you'd expect from a compulsive beard groomer. The snip of shears echoed through cold stone halls while rows of flickering flames tried their best to behave. You can practically hear Brother Leonard sighing as he approaches candle number 42. But then came innovation. Sometime between the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, candle makers in parts of Europe started using a new trick: braided cotton wicks. Braiding wasn't just decorative, it gave the wick structure. A well-braided wick would curl slightly as it burned, bending into the flame. This curl allowed the tip of the wick to burn away naturally, eliminating the need for constant trimming. A miracle. Well, sort of. Not everyone knew how to braid. Not all cotton was created equal, and even the best wicks could misbehave if your wax was too soft, too impure, or your candle was crooked from cooling too fast. Let's take a weird detour. In 15th century Italy, some chandlers began experimenting with adding salt or borax to the wick to improve burning quality. This was fringe science at its finest. Some combinations helped the wick burn more cleanly. Others turned the flame into a sputtering hazard that sounded like boiling soup. That didn't stop people from trying, though. Candle chemistry was trial by fire. Literally. Here's a scholarly debate for you to drift off to. Some researchers argue that the wick revolution, yes, it has a name, marked the beginning of candles becoming domesticated. No longer wild little torches that needed constant care, but household tools that could work quietly in the background. Others say this shift didn't really take hold until industrialization. Either way, once wicks became easier to manage, candles got more popular, safer, smarter, quieter. You could finally read in bed without accidentally reenacting the Great Fire of London, and read they did. With better wicks came better candles, and with better candles came late-night study, silent prayer, secret writing. Candles weren't just a source of light. They were portals into thought, into silence, into possibility. It's hard to imagine now, but the simple ability to sit at a desk past sundown was revolutionary. With a self-consuming wick and a slow-burning wax, you could do the unthinkable, outlast the night. Of course, not all candles behaved. Let's talk about tunneling. Candle tunneling is what happens when the wick burns straight down, leaving walls of unmelted wax on the sides. It's wasteful and embarrassing. Your candle becomes a crater. Back then, there were no handy YouTube tutorials explaining how to fix it. You just sighed and lit a new one. Poorer households often reused old wax from tunneled candles, scraped it out, melted it down, re-poured it into whatever mold was available. Wooden cup, clay dish, even a hollowed-out bone in rare cases. Wax was precious. Waste was not an option. And now for something unexpected. In parts of Eastern Europe, particularly among some Romani communities, candle wicks were charmed, as in spells were whispered over the wick as it was being twisted. Superstitions claimed it would ward off evil, protect the home, or even influence a lover's dreams. Was it practical? Nope. Did it smell like roasted goat hair? Probably, but it brought comfort. And that's kind of the whole point of candlelight, isn't it? You sitting here now in your imaginary 1500s village home wouldn't just see the wick as a tool. You might see it as something more, a whispering line between here and there, between the known and the unknown, between day and night. Let's not forget the psychological magic of it all. Candlelight flickers, it moves, it breathes with the room. You don't just see by it, you feel something. Safety, calm, focus, a tiny fire that doesn't want to hurt you, just warm you, maybe even listen. That feeling? That started to matter in the quieter corners of late medieval life, as scholars copied manuscripts, as herbalists ground roots, as seamstresses mended clothes for people who didn't appreciate them. The candle sat on the table, unassuming, flickering, quietly burning away while the world outside screamed with war, plague, hunger, and snow. And that wick? It curled and burned and left no ash behind. A small miracle indeed. So tonight, as you watch your own candle flicker beside you, maybe consider the wick. That little twist of cotton, once so fussy, now so tame. The quiet core of centuries of trial, error, smoke, and ash. Not every invention needs to shout. Some change the world with a whisper of flame. The walls are stone, the roof is thatch, and you're somewhere in late medieval Europe, clutching a stub of candle like it's a sacred artifact. Because tonight, the line between light and darkness isn't just visual, it's social. It tells the world who you are. You see, candles were no longer just about seeing. By the 15th century, they were about status. Specifically, what kind of candle you burned, and how many you could afford to light at once. Welcome to the world of luxury light, where royalty glowed in beeswax and commoners got whatever was left at the bottom of the fat bucket. If you were nobility, you didn't just own candles, you owned aesthetic candles, beeswax, golden in hue, dripping slowly like honey from a dream. These weren't just candles, they were statements. They sat in silver candelabras, lighting banquet halls and libraries filled with Latin texts. No one had time to read. They were taller, smoother, and cleaner than anything your local chandler sold. Lighting them was like saying, "I've won the medieval lottery." Royal chapels, for example, use candles to dramatic effect. Ever been in a cathedral with stained glass and echoing choirs, all lit by golden light that smells faintly sweet? Yeah, that was intentional. Kings and queens wanted God's favor, and maybe a little architectural swagger. Some monarchs even had candle budgets recorded in royal ledgers. Can you imagine Queen Isabella holding a financial meeting and saying, "Yes, but what about wax allocation for the March feast?" Mainstream's historical fact. By the late 1400s, some noble households burned hundreds of candles a day. Special servants were assigned to monitor them, replace them, and clean up the drippings. You think changing light bulbs is annoying? Try scraping wax off a banquet table the size of a small ship. Now flip the coin. Common folk, artisans, laborers, farmers were working with scraps. Often these were stubby tallow candles, misshapen from hurried hand dipping and cooled crooked on drafty windowsills. If you were lucky, your local chandler sold in pieces at a discount. If not, you boiled down old cooking fat and made your own. Did it work? Sure. Did it smell like burnt stew? Absolutely. Here's a strange fringe fact. In some towns, parish candles were distributed to poor households on holy days. These were leftover ceremonial candles, still technically blessed, that families would use sparingly, lighting only for illness, prayer, or childbirth. Imagine rationing light like it's sacred medicine, because to them it was. The difference between peasant and prince wasn't just gold or title, it was how much of the dark you could push away. And it wasn't just the candle itself, it was how you used it. Nobility often had chandeliers suspended from the ceiling, sometimes with pulley systems so the candles could be lowered and trimmed without climbing anything. These chandeliers weren't just for light, they were for show. A circle of golden wax burning 20 flames high above your head, casting dramatic shadows on the tapestries. That's medieval Instagram-level flexing. In contrast, peasants kept candles in simple holders, wooden, iron, or just a lump of clay with a nail to prop the candle upright. If you were really thrifty or desperate, you'd just wedge it into a bread crust to keep it stable. Multitasking, light your room and feed the mice. Here's where things get oddly specific. Candle placement became its own form of etiquette. In noble households, more candles were placed near places of intellectual or spiritual activity, libraries, altars, study desks. The idea was that wisdom and holiness deserved better lighting. Dining areas got fewer candles. Why? Because dim light made food look more appealing. A trick still used in restaurants today. Yes, your overpriced soup looks better when it's lit like a Renaissance painting. Now let's talk weddings. Ah yes, the medieval wedding. Lots of feasting, occasional plague outbreaks, and, of course, candles. Beeswax was considered auspicious. Brides often carried candles in processions, symbolizing purity and the light of new life. Some weddings even included candle-sharing rituals, where wax from the groom's family candle was used to light the bride's. An early, flammable form of what's mine is yours, and death. Also candle-heavy. During funerals, candles weren't just decor. They were spiritual insurance. The belief was that candles helped guide the soul through the afterlife, warded off demons, and kept the grieving from fully falling into darkness. Some traditions even required a candle to burn for days after death, a vigil light to keep watch over the soul's departure. There's an open scholarly debate about just how widespread these customs were across regions, but candle use in rites of passage, birth, marriage, death, was nearly universal by the late medieval era. Light marked transition, flame meant meaning. Let's not ignore the weird stuff, though. In parts of Europe, especially the more superstitious corners, there were stories of cursed candles. These were made by mixing wax with grave dirt or using wicks braided from hair. Burn one of these in someone's house and you'd invite bad luck, sickness, or heartbreak. Total nonsense? Probably, but the fear was real. And it's not hard to understand why. Candles held power, literal and metaphorical. A dancing flame could mean comfort or chaos. Back to the households now. Even in more modest middle-class homes, you could tell a lot about someone by their candles. Were they beeswax? Tallow? Molded evenly or drippy and patchy? Were they displayed in brass holders or tucked in crusty sconces? Candles were social markers. Your evening light was as revealing as your wardrobe. One particularly poetic touch. Some wealthier families carved inscriptions into large ceremonial candles. Names, prayers, dates. As the wax melted, the messages disappeared, a slow fade of intention into memory. It's easy to imagine someone watching their loved one's name sink into the wax, night after night, as the candle burned lower. Heartbreaking, beautiful, temporarily eternal. Let's wrap this flickering scene. You're at a long, creaky table in a manor house. A chandelier above glows with 20 beeswax flames. A fire crackles in the hearth. A servant replaces the candles by the hour, each one smooth, identical, perfect. The air smells faintly of honey and roasted pheasant. You sip wine. You pretend not to notice the peasant woman outside the window, walking home in the dark, with a stump of tallow held in a rag. Same night, same world, two kinds of light. And somewhere between them, the glowing line between privilege and perseverance, luxury and survival, burns the candle, always flickering, always telling the truth. You're now crossing the Atlantic, rocking gently on the deck of a creaky wooden ship, braving the salty breeze and the uncertain horizon. You're no longer in the old world's castles or workshops, but in early colonial America, where the candle story takes a curious turn, introducing a small, scrappy, and wildly impractical contender, the bayberry candle. Imagine this. You're a settler in New England, surrounded by dense forests, frostbitten mornings, and a burning desire to not live in total darkness when the sun dips below the treetops. You've got your tallow candles, sure, but there's a local bush with waxy berries, bayberries, that the indigenous peoples have used for centuries to make candle wax. The settlers try it out, thinking, hey, it smells better and might be cleaner than pig fat. And in theory, they're right. Bayberry candles are made by boiling the berries to extract a fragrant green wax, which is then mixed with other waxes or sometimes used alone. They smell lovely, sweet, fresh, almost like a walk through an evergreen forest. Perfect, right? Except for one major catch. Bayberry wax doesn't yield much. You need about 8 pounds of berries to make 1 pound of wax. That's a lot of foraging. Plus, the wax burns quickly and is brittle, making the candles fragile and short-lived. The bayberry candle is a classic example of something that sounds great but isn't terribly practical for daily use. Still, bayberry candles became a colonial tradition, especially during Christmas. Families would burn them as special treats, lightening up their homes with greenish, forest-scented glimmers during the long winter nights. They symbolize celebration, hope, and a connection to the land. Think of it as the original artisanal candle, before the word artisan was even invented. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Bayberry candles were highly prized in colonial America and considered luxury items. They were sometimes given as gifts or used during important ceremonies. Because if you could burn a bayberry candle, you weren't just lighting a room, you were lighting a symbol of resilience and local ingenuity. But as you can guess, their impracticality meant they weren't the go-to source of light for everyday use. Colonists still relied mostly on tallow or beeswax candles or on whale oil lamps if they could afford them. Speaking of whale oil, that's a story for later. But back to bayberries. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some colonial-era texts suggest bayberry candles were believed to ward off evil spirits and bad luck. Burning one during winter solstice was supposed to protect the household from witches and demons. While there's no hard proof this was a widespread belief, it fits neatly into the folklore tapestry of early America. And there's a scholarly debate about the origins of bayberry candle making in colonial culture. Did it come directly from indigenous peoples? Or was it a European adaptation of native practices? Some argue the latter, emphasizing cultural exchange. Others say it was a colonial invention, a way for settlers to claim native resources while maintaining their own traditions. Either way, bayberry candles symbolize a fascinating intersection of cultures and survival strategies. Now imagine you're back in your colonial kitchen. The winter wind howls outside, rattling the window panes. A bayberry candle flickers on the rough-hewn table, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Its sweet scent mingles with the smell of baking bread and pine boughs. You feel a small comfort amid the vast wilderness. But let's not forget that the candle burns fast. You have to treasure every minute of its light. Colonial candle making was hard work. Women often gathered bayberries, boiling them over open fires in iron pots for hours. The wax skimmed off the surface was then molded into candles, sometimes dipped multiple times to build thickness. It was a labor of love and necessity. In winter months, when days were short and nights unforgiving, candles were precious commodities. Colonists also experimented with mixing bayberry wax with tallow or beeswax to improve durability. Some recipes passed down in handwritten journals called for adding pine resin or even animal fat to the mix to create a more stable candle. Beyond practical use, bayberry candles became a part of early American identity, symbols of making do with what the land provided, blending old world traditions with new world resources. They were a small but shining beacon of ingenuity. One more quirky note. In some New England towns, bayberry candle makers formed informal guilds or cooperatives to share knowledge and resources. They held contests to make the longest-lasting candle, or the brightest, or the most fragrant. Talk about competitive candle culture. As colonial America grew, so did its candle industries. The humble bayberry candle, though never practical for mass lighting, remained a beloved seasonal tradition, a green flame against the dark winter nights. So tonight, as you breathe in the subtle fragrance of your own candle, maybe vanilla or pine, remember the settlers who cherished a slow-burning green candle that burned away the cold and fear of a new world. Bayberry candles weren't just light, they were hope, adaptation, and the stubborn human will to push back the darkness, one slow flame at a time. The salty tang of the sea is in the air now, mixing with the faintly oily aroma of something far more powerful and disturbing. You're aboard a wooden whaling ship rolling gently over choppy Atlantic waves. The creak of ropes, the shouts of sailors, and the relentless wind fill the space around you. But in the heart of this floating world is a secret ingredient lighting the way, spermaceti. Now, spermaceti isn't sperm, at least not in the way you're thinking. It's a waxy white substance found in the head cavity of the sperm whale. Named centuries ago by confused whalers, it's smooth, almost jelly-like, and unlike tallow or beeswax, it burns bright and clean. More importantly, it burns longer and produces a steady, smokeless flame. This wasn't just a candle wax, it was the cutting edge of candle technology in the 18th and 19th centuries. But before you light your ceremonial spermaceti candle and feel all fancy, let's talk about the backstory and the grossness. Whaling was brutal, deadly, and disturbingly smelly. Sailors would chase sperm whales for months, harpoon them, then strip out barrels of blubber and the coveted spermaceti organ. This organ's waxy oil was processed into candle wax. It was highly prized for lighting everything from parlors to lighthouses. Here's a mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, spermaceti candles were considered the finest candles money could buy, outshining beeswax in popularity. They burned longer, with a clearer flame, and didn't leave a greasy residue. A step up in the illumination game. But, and this is a big but, whale hunting decimated populations. Sperm whales were driven close to extinction by the relentless demand for their wax and oil. It was an ecological disaster wrapped in a romantic maritime legend. The smell aboard those ships? Not exactly perfume. Imagine a combination of rotten fish, raw blubber, and sweat. Unbearable, but somehow overshadowed by the lure of profit and survival. Here's a fringe fact. Some sailors believed that the spermaceti organ held mystical properties. Stories circulated that burning spermaceti candles brought good luck or calm seas. Whether true or superstition, it added to the wax's allure. Spermaceti wax wasn't just used in candles, it found its way into cosmetics, lubricants, and even early plastics. The versatility made sperm whales a jackpot for whalers, and the candles made from their wax a symbol of industrial progress and human dominance over nature. Of course, the ethics of all this were murky, even then. Whaling communities wrestled with the balance between livelihood and the growing awareness of depletion. Conservation wasn't a thing yet, but some voices expressed concern. One scholarly debate still ongoing. Was the rise of spermaceti candles a key factor in the near extinction of sperm whales? Some argue other factors contributed, but most agree the candle industry played a significant role in the population crash. Back on shore, spermaceti candles graced parlors of the wealthy and middle class alike. They were often molded into elaborate shapes or colored with tints. Unlike earlier candles, they could be mass-produced with relative ease. This was candle industrialization before the Industrial Revolution fully kicked in. A curious tidbit, American entrepreneur Alonzo Decker patented a process in the 1830s to purify spermaceti wax and produce uniform candles that burned more efficiently. This innovation helped usher in the era of bright, affordable household candles. As you sit in your comfortable chair, maybe with a candle flickering beside you, consider this. The soft glow illuminating your room once depended on creatures that roamed the vast oceans, hunted for a rare, waxy treasure. The price was high, for the whales, for the sailors, and for the fragile balance of nature. And yet, from this strange and somber history came the bright flame that helped light the way through darker nights. So as you watch your candle burn, remember the whales, remember the sailors, and remember that light, however beautiful, often carries shadows. The world is shifting beneath your feet. The steady rhythm of oars and sails gives way to the rumble of machines and the hiss of steam. You're in the 19th century now, a time when candle making was industrializing at a dizzying pace. Factories are cropping up in cities, churning out candles by the thousands. The humble candle is about to get a makeover thanks to science, chemistry, and a little thing called stearic acid. But first, a quick reality check. Candles were still essential. Gaslighting was emerging, sure, but it was expensive and dangerous, prone to explosions and leaks. Electricity was still a gleam in a scientist's eye, so candles, in their many forms, remained the go-to source of illumination in homes, theaters, and streets worldwide. The breakthrough came when chemists figured out how to extract and purify stearic acid, a fatty acid derived from animal fats and palm oil, which, when mixed with other waxes, produced candles that burned cleaner and more steadily than traditional tallow. This meant cheaper, longer-lasting candles with less smoke. You could mass produce them, too, using molds and mechanized dipping machines. Suddenly, candles weren't the rare, precious items of centuries past. They were everyday commodities. Mainstream historical fact, by the mid-1800s, candle factories dotted cities like London, Paris, and New York. These factories employed hundreds of workers, many of them women and children, in grueling conditions. The air inside was thick with the smell of hot fat and wax. The floors slippery, the machinery dangerous. Industrial candles also made possible new social experiences. Public theaters stayed open later. Families could read after dinner without straining their eyes. The pace of life began to shift, extending beyond sunset in ways previously unimaginable. But it wasn't all progress and clean burns. Factory-made candles sometimes sacrificed quality for quantity. Cheap additives could make candles brittle or cause them to smoke excessively. Labor conditions were harsh and child labor was rampant. The candle industry, like many others in the industrial era, had a dark side, a fringe tidbit. Some candle factories secretly experimented with scents and colors, trying to mimic natural smells or create exotic aromas. Early attempts included infusing candles with musk, vanilla, and even whiskey. Not all were hits. Some produced fumes that made workers dizzy or sick, but they laid the groundwork for today's scented candle craze. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about the environmental impact of industrial candle production in the 19th century. While it reduced reliance on whaling and beeswax, it increased demand for animal fats and palm oil, contributing indirectly to deforestation and habitat loss. The full consequences of this shift are still being studied. Meanwhile, the rise of gaslighting began to challenge the candle's dominance. Streets lit with gas lamps looked safer, shops stayed open longer, urban nightlife blossomed, candles were increasingly seen as quaint or romantic rather than practical. But candle makers fought back. They marketed candles as cozy, intimate, and essential to home life. Advertisements celebrated the soft, natural glow that gas and later electric light couldn't replicate. Candles became symbols of warmth, comfort, and tradition amid a rapidly changing world. Imagine a 19th century parlor. A family gathers around a table lit by several stearic acid candles, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on wallpapered walls. The smell of beeswax and early perfumes fills the air. Outside, gas lamps glow yellow on cobblestone streets. Inside, the candle's warm glow feels like a refuge from the industrial storm. It was also a time when candle accessories flourished. Candelabras, snuffers, wick trimmers, all becoming household essentials. The candle ritual became part of daily life. Even as new lighting technologies beckoned, some regions even saw candle-making guilds evolve into early industrial unions fighting for better pay and working conditions. The candle, once a symbol of status, now embodied the struggles and hopes of working-class families. So the industrial era didn't just change how candles were made, it changed who made them, who used them, and what they meant. You might think this chapter marks the candle's decline, but actually it's the beginning of a fascinating reinvention, a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation that still burns bright today. The crackle of a gas lamp lights the cobblestone street outside your window. The scent of coal smoke mingles with the horse manure and the murmurs of late-night pedestrians. It's the 19th century, and the world is changing fast. The steady glow of candles is beginning to lose its hold on human hearts and homes. Gaslight is here, and it's dazzling. Imagine walking down a London street illuminated by rows of gas lamps, their bright yellow flames chasing away shadows that once ruled the night. No more fumbling with wax and wicks. No more smoky, stinky rooms. Suddenly light is everywhere. Streets, theaters, shops, all bathed in a steady, controlled blaze. Mainstream historical fact. Gaslighting was first introduced in London in 1807 and quickly spread through Europe and America. It transformed cities overnight, literally brightening the dark corners of urban life. But as gas lamps took hold, candles started to lose their practical edge. They were no longer the primary source of light. They became ornamental, romantic, nostalgic. The transition wasn't smooth, though. Many people were resistant. Gaslighting was expensive to install, required maintenance, and was prone to leaks and explosions. Houses still relied on candles for intimate spaces, personal use, and emergency lighting. Gaslight might illuminate the streets, but candles lit the hearth. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some early skeptics believed that gaslight disrupted the natural rhythm of life. They argued that candlelight was gentler on the eyes, better for sleep, and more in tune with the body's circadian clock. Sound familiar? Modern debates about blue light and screen time echo these 19th century concerns. Electricity was still decades away from widespread adoption. Thomas Edison's light bulb wouldn't be patented until 1879. So for a time, gas and candlelight coexisted, each serving different needs and moods. There's a scholarly debate around how quickly candles fell out of everyday use once gaslight arrived. Some historians suggest urban elites abandoned candles rapidly, embracing gaslight for convenience and status. Others note that rural areas, small towns, and poorer households clung to candles for generations. In many ways, candles became symbols of the private sphere, the bedroom, the parlor, the chapel, while gaslight illuminated the public. This shift had cultural impacts. Artists, poets, and writers romanticized candlelight, associating it with intimacy, mystery, and spirituality. The candle flame flickering in a quiet room became a metaphor for the soul, for life itself. A curious detail: Victorian-era homes often used candles specifically for social rituals. Dinner parties, card games, and evening readings were accompanied by candles to create an atmosphere of warmth and elegance. Electric light might be bright and practical, but it lacked the poetry of a dancing flame. Even with gaslight's rise, candle manufacturing continued to thrive, albeit for different reasons. Candles became decorative art pieces, scented mood enhancers, and religious necessities. They were gifts, tokens, and reminders of simpler times. Imagine you're sitting in a 19th century parlor reading by candlelight as gaslight softly glows through the window. The contrast between the two forms of light mirrors the tension between old and new, tradition and progress, home and city, and then electricity arrived. But for now, gaslight still rules the night, dimming the candle's once bright reign. Yet even in the shadows, candles hold their ground, not as mere tools of illumination, but as keepers of memory, mood, and meaning, because sometimes the soft glow of a candle says what bright light never can. Now the world has turned again. Electricity hums quietly in the walls, and streets glow with the steady buzz of bulbs. But in this modern age, candles are far from obsolete. No, they've found a new life, a new reason to flicker and glow. You're sitting in a cozy room, soft music playing. The overhead light is off, but dozens of candles burn around you, some scented, some unscented, some nestled in glass jars, others dripping on ornate holders. The air smells faintly of lavender, sandalwood, and something crisp like fresh linen. This isn't about illumination anymore. This is about ritual, romance, and quiet reflection. Candles have transformed from practical tools into symbols of mood and meaning. Let's rewind for a moment. During the mid-20th century, candles made a comeback, but not for light. It was their ambiance that people craved. Restaurants dimmed the fluorescent harshness and lit candles on tables. Couples lit candles on anniversaries, weddings, and quiet dinners. Churches used candles in rituals, prayers, and vigils. The candle flame was soft, intimate, a whisper in a noisy world. Mainstream historical fact: the candle renaissance began around the 1960s and 70s, partly due to a growing interest in spirituality, self-care, and alternative lifestyles. Scented candles flooded the market, from patchouli to rose, and candle making became a popular home craft. Some companies began marketing candles as stress relief aids. Aromatherapy candles promised to relax the mind, reduce anxiety, and even improve sleep. The candle flame wasn't just a source of light, it was a tool for healing. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some candle enthusiasts claim that different candle colors and scents can influence mood and energy. Red for passion, blue for calm, eucalyptus for clarity. While scientific evidence is mixed, the placebo effect and personal association make the experience meaningful for many. Candles also play a significant role in various religious and cultural rituals. Lighting a candle can symbolize hope, remembrance, purification, or transformation. Across religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, and others, candles are silent prayers in flame form. The shift to candles as decorative and spiritual objects reflects broader cultural changes. In a fast-paced digital world, slowing down and focusing on a flickering flame is an act of rebellion. a moment of mindfulness, a return to something ancient and simple. There's a scholarly debate about whether this candle revival is sustainable or merely a passing trend. With environmental concerns about paraffin, a petroleum byproduct, and the rise of soy and beeswax alternatives, the candle industry is evolving again. But the flame remains constant. You might also notice candles in rituals of celebration, birthdays, holidays, or even political protests. They're portable symbols of unity and resolve, carrying light into darkness, whether literal or metaphorical. Candles today also inspire artistry. From sculpted beeswax figures to DIY scented blends, candle making has become a creative outlet. You can find candles shaped like everything from cupcakes to cacti to famous movie characters. The humble candle has become a canvas. Let's toss in a quirky detail. Candle baths have become a spa trend where people surround themselves with candles, sometimes dozens, to create an immersive sensory experience. Think of it as bathing in candlelight, both literally and metaphorically. Though please don't try lighting the water. What hasn't changed is the fundamental feeling that comes with candlelight. The quiet warmth, the dancing shadows, the gentle glow that beckons us to slow down and breathe. So as you sit surrounded by soft flickers, know that you're part of a long, winding story. One that started with a fat-soaked reed and grew into a global ritual of light and life. Candles aren't just things we light. They're moments we create. Moments of peace, reflection, and connection. In a noisy, electric world, that flame feels like a soft, familiar heartbeat. Now, lean in a little closer, because the world of candles today is a fascinating blend of artistry, obsession, and downright weirdness. You might think a candle is just wax and a wick, but modern candle culture has transformed that simple formula into something akin to fine art, and sometimes a little bizarre. Imagine walking into a candle boutique. The shelves are lined with candles shaped like intricate sculptures, human faces, giant flowers, even architectural models. Some candles look like desserts. Think giant donuts, cupcakes, or melting ice cream cones. Others mimic strange objects like crystals or quirky animals. You might even find candles shaped like famous movie characters or mythical creatures. This isn't just decorative, it's a form of wax artistry. Skilled candle makers use hand carving, molding, and layering techniques to create these stunning works. It's a hobby and a profession, with artists pushing the boundaries of what candles can look like. Here's a mainstream fact. The candle artistry trend really took off in the early 21st century, fueled by social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. Candle makers share their creations with millions, sparking a global community of collectors and fans. Now, onto scents, which have become the heart and soul of modern candles. The scented candle market is booming. You can find candles infused with everything from traditional lavender and vanilla to wild experimental fragrances like fireside bacon, freshly printed books, or morning dew on pine needles. Companies invest millions developing signature scents designed to evoke memories, moods, or even fantasies. Here's a fringe tidbit. There's a niche but passionate group of olfactory artists who study how specific candle scents affect brain chemistry and emotions. While the science is still emerging, it's clear that scent can be a powerful trigger for memory and mood. But some candle scents can be controversial. Fireside bacon might sound delicious, but not everyone wants their living room smelling like a breakfast diner. Old bookshop candles evoke nostalgia, but might creep out anyone who prefers fresh air. The range is vast and sometimes odd. Then there's the rise of DIY candle making. People buy kits online to craft their own scented or decorative candles at home. This craft combines creativity with relaxation, a hands-on antidote to screen fatigue. The process of melting wax, choosing scents, and watching the candle set is oddly meditative. And of course, there's a darker side to modern candle obsession. Reports have surfaced about people collecting hundreds of candles, obsessively curating their scent libraries, and even forming communities centered around candle drops and releases. Yes, candles have their own hype culture now. One quirky cultural moment, the candle burnout phenomenon, where enthusiasts admit to lighting so many candles they can barely keep up with the scent combinations or clean up the wax drippings. It's a real thing. In spiritual and wellness circles, candles remain central. Yoga studios, meditation spaces, and wellness retreats use candles to create calm, focus, and sacred space. Candles are tools for grounding, intention setting, and mindfulness. Some scholars argue this modern candle culture reflects a human yearning for connection to nature, to ritual, to self, in an increasingly fast artificial world. A candle's flame offers a moment of pause, a small fire that says, "Here is calm." And let's not forget the surprising innovations. New eco-friendly candles made from soy, beeswax, or coconut wax are designed to reduce environmental impact. Some candles even incorporate natural wooden wicks that crackle softly, mimicking a fireplace. So when you light your favorite candle tonight, whether it's classic, quirky, or hand-carved, know you're part of a vast, vibrant tradition. From primal fire flickers to high art wax sculptures, candles continue to capture human imagination and soothe restless hearts. In a world rushing forward, a candle invites us to slow down, breathe, and simply be. There's a certain magic to the flicker of a candle. It's a flame that has danced through millennia. From flickering rushlights to ornate beeswax tapers, from crude tallow sticks to scented soy jars glowing softly on your nightstand. But beyond the warmth and light, candles have long been shrouded in superstition, legend, and a little bit of mystery. Imagine, if you will, a time before science explained why candles flicker, or why flames behave the way they do. Back then, people whispered to their candles, believed their flickering had messages, and feared what a dying flame might mean. One of the most widespread superstitions centered on the candle flame itself. A steady, upright flame was seen as a good omen, a sign of peace, health, and spiritual favor. But if the flame flickered wildly, sputtered, or danced erratically, it was thought to signal approaching misfortune or even the presence of spirits. In medieval Europe, it was common for people to interpret the flame's behavior during important moments. For example, during a funeral, an unsteady flame was said to indicate the unrest of the departed soul, or that dark forces were near. At weddings, a candle that flickered towards the bride was considered a blessing, while one that flickered away was a bad sign. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Candles were often used in divination practices where practitioners watched the flame's movement to predict future events. This was especially common in folk traditions throughout Eastern Europe and parts of the British Isles. The open flame was also thought to be a direct connection to the spiritual realm. Some believed that spirits could travel along the flicker, entering and exiting the living world through candlelight. This belief led to numerous rituals involving candles, lighting them to protect the home, to guide the dead, or to send prayers. And it wasn't just Europe. In many cultures worldwide, candles and lamps have played a role in bridging the seen and unseen. In Hindu traditions, the diya, a small oil lamp, is lit to invite positive energies and dispel darkness not only physically, but spiritually. In Jewish tradition, the Shabbat, candle lights welcome peace into the home. Candles are almost universally powerful symbols. A fringe tidbit: in some rural communities, it was believed that talking to a candle's flame could summon lost loved ones or reveal hidden truths. The ritual would often involve whispering a name or a question to the flame and watching how it responded. There's also the eerie practice of candle magic, where candles were inscribed with names, symbols, or prayers, then burned with the intent of influencing real-world outcomes. This kind of sympathetic magic was common in folk traditions and still has adherents today. But these beliefs weren't just superstition, they were ways to cope with the unknown. Fire, after all, is both life-giving and destructive. Watching a flame is hypnotic. It invites reflection and reverence. Let's touch on one particularly curious belief from the Victorian era. The idea that extinguishing a candle with your breath could accidentally blow out a soul's presence in the room. So instead, many people use candle snuffers to gently smother the flame, respecting the spiritual energy it held. And then there's the legend of the witch's candle, a candle supposedly infused with spells, curses, or protective charms. Burning one in your home could either invite dark forces or repel them, depending on the spell. The origins of these tales are tangled in folklore, but they highlight the deep connection people felt between candles and supernatural forces. Even today, candlelight vigils are powerful symbols of solidarity, mourning, and hope. The simple act of lighting a candle in the darkness speaks louder than words. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much of these candle superstitions shaped social behavior and cultural norms. Some historians argue that fear of fire and the dangerous nature of candles themselves fueled many of these beliefs. Others see candles as focal points of communal memory and spiritual practice, transcending mere practicality. So as you light your candle tonight, maybe say a quiet word or two to that flame, because it's been listening longer than you might think, a companion through centuries of human fear, hope, and wonder. The candle's glow isn't just light. It's a story, a ritual, a heartbeat in the quiet night. You find yourself at the edge of a quiet room. The soft glow of a single candle casts gentle shadows, the flicker ebbing and flowing like a quiet breath. This moment is the culmination of an incredible journey, a journey from the earliest, smoky attempts at light through centuries of human ingenuity, ritual, struggle, and reinvention. Tonight, that candle isn't just wax and wick. It's history, it's resilience, it's something more. Think back to that first flicker in a cave. Animal fat, moss, and desperation. That tiny flame held the promise of survival, of stretching the day into night. It was the first defiance against darkness, the first step toward the light-filled world we know today. Over millennia, humans transformed that primal flame, from rushlights that barely lasted an hour, to the elegant beeswax candles of Roman temples, to the smoky tallow sticks lighting medieval homes. Every candle told a story. Candles were power and poverty, wealth and want, faith and fear. The monks who painstakingly crafted pure beeswax tapers were not just making light, they were making sacred connection. The stinky chandlers, melting down animal fat, were fueling the lives of countless families who relied on their light for work, safety, and comfort. The whalers risking life and limb-hunted creatures to provide the luminous spermaceti that brightened parlors and lighthouses alike. The industrial age brought new chemistry, mass production, and new challenges. Gas and electricity threatened to make candles obsolete. But the flame endured, evolving from practical necessity to symbol, from source of light to source of mood, meditation, and meaning. Candles have flickered through joy and sorrow. They have marked births and deaths, lit celebrations and vigils. They have been objects of superstition, art, and even obsession. In every era, they have offered more than light. They have offered a sense of presence, a comforting heartbeat in the quiet dark. And now, here you are, part of this ancient lineage. When you light your candle tonight, whether to soothe stress, set a romantic mood, or simply enjoy the flicker, You participate in a tradition older than kingdoms, older than cities, older than even written words. The candle's flame is humble, fragile, and yet enduring. It reminds us that even the smallest light can push back the darkness, that beauty and utility can coexist, and that simple things can carry profound meaning. So as your eyes grow heavy and the world quiets around you, let the candle's glow be your soft guardian. Let its warmth fill the corners of your room and your mind. Know that you are safe, connected to the countless souls who have lit candles before you, and that you carry forward their light. It's okay to rest now. The flame will burn gently on your behalf. Let your thoughts drift, slow and soften. Let the night enfold you like a warm blanket woven from thousands of flickering flames. You are part of a long story, a story told in wax and wick, in smoke and glow. And as you close your eyes, the candle's flame dances softly, a whispered good night from history itself.